Good morning and welcome back. I was just looking over some of the notes that I made in 1975 from my 222 Remington. I've been asked by some people what I consider to be my favorite cartridges or what cartridges I would recommend to them. Well, I have an awful lot of favorite cartridges, but I think tops on the list, one of my most sentimental favorites has been the 222. The 222 Remington, it was basically a victim of circumstances. Through no fault of its own, matter of fact, as a matter of rather cruel irony, it was the very father of the 223. The 223, which has eclipsed it in popularity, was made popular simply because of its availability as a military round. That is the one thing which was the impetus behind so many cartridges in American history. At one time, the 30-40 Craig became a very popular deer cartridge and rifle simply because it was the service cartridge at the turn of the century when we were in the Spanish-American War. The 30-06, as everybody knows, was the service cartridge during World War I and World War II, and throughout Korea. The 308 became extremely popular simply because it became the U.S. service cartridge and in a more broad sense, the NATO cartridge for all the allies throughout the world. So, and the 223, as we know, the same situation. The 223 simply became very popular owing to its availability as a military cartridge. Now, I just want to go back over some of the history and why I would still consider the 222 to be a vastly superior round to the 223. Now, I love the 223. I shoot it a lot, and it doesn't have any shortcomings at all. But I can say unequivocally that the 222 is a more accurate cartridge, and I would say that without question it's also a more pleasant cartridge to shoot. The 222 turned about 66 years old just recently. It was introduced in 1950. The then engineer and designer and architect of so many things in the Remington company, who worked in the Remington custom shop for 35 years, Mike Walker was its designer. The late Mike Walker just died only 3 years ago in 2013 at the ripe old age of 101, and he was continuing to shoot right up to his last years. He was the designer of the Remington 721, the 722, the Model 700 Remington, the 40X target rifle, and the infamous trigger that was his design. And just as a matter of note, there was nothing ever wrong with that trigger. I worked with that trigger countless times. There was absolutely nothing wrong with that trigger. I hasten to say that everything that was ever wrong with that trigger belonged to the fiddle factor. There were many people who, because of the trigger design, it was easily manipulated by fools that didn't know what they were doing, who attempted to make it into a 2-ounce or 3-ounce trigger, and thereby, blew their head off or something. It had nothing to do with, and it was certainly driven in large part by a network industry that brought light upon it that it didn't deserve. But Mike Walker's designs were of the highest quality in all regards. It's just a little historical background that preceded the 222. In the years prior to World War II, actually even back to the 20s, 30s and 40s, there was great interest in precision accuracy shooting. That might seem a little bit strange to people who are, think that maybe they're in the first generation of the accuracy shooters. Well, trust me, there were a lot of accuracy shooters and long-range accuracy shooters back in the 30s and 40s. They're the people who designed and envisioned cartridges such as the 22-250, which was designed by a gentleman named Gebby back in 1933. The 22-250 is certainly one of the most popular and most accurate of all the ultra long range varmints. And it was only in 1965 that it was finally commercialized by Remington. So it's now 50 years old commercially, but it was much older than that before. It was 30 years older than that before Remington finally adopted it. And that's the case with so many cartridges. That there were an awful lot of very serious accuracy-minded shooters back in those days preceding World War II, and the culture was different then. Certainly, the farm fields of New Hampshire that I'm living in right now, they were much different. Most of the farm fields that existed back in the 30s and 40s and even 50s have long since turned into woodland in New Hampshire and much of New England. The fields have grown up. Dairy farmers have simply moved out, and it's rugged farming in this part of the country because of the hills and rocks. But because of and naturally there were government subsidies and things like that affected milk prices. So everything changed up here, and because of the relative smallness of the New England states, most of New Hampshire is only most of the inhabited part of New Hampshire that people visit is only a couple of hours from downtown Boston. So it's a very small type of community atmosphere, but it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and the available farm fields have a lot of them have dried up, and where there are farm fields, quite often you'll find that there are an awful lot of residences around in the local within spitting distance of the nearest pasture. So it precludes the ability to be able to just wander out into a pasture and shoot at woodchucks as we used to do. And that's further aggravated by the fact that woodchucks have simply been devastated by coyotes in our state, as they are in so many. The type of shooting that I used to enjoy back in the 60s when I used to go woodchuck shooting, that just simply has gone away. Driving down the highway, you used to see woodchucks every mile or two in the median strip feeding, and you used to see them up on the side of the embankment as you were driving along. You'd see them out in fields, and you'd see them in people's backyards. They just simply have ceased to exist in most areas. So that has killed off a lot of the interest of varmint shooting in our area, and but back in those days prior to World War II, there was a great, like I say, there was a great development of accuracy shooting. Bench rest shooting was becoming very popular, and became especially popular in the years following World War II, immediately following. Untitled scopes being mounted, line and target spot scopes being mounted on beautifully accurate guns that were capable of extremely fine accuracy. And they didn't have nearly as much to work with as we have now. The development of bullets, just the bullets in the last few decades, has been something that we take for granted. We are looking for bullets that will always go into one hole. That was something that simply wasn't available in the earlier days. it was difficult to find anybody who could put together a very good load, simply because they didn't have so many bullets to work with. They didn't have the number of powders to select from. Everything was a little bit cruder, and so the limitations to their accuracy had nothing to do with their ability. It had to do with the available components and things. But the cartridges were of a stellar design. Most of the accuracy cartridges, though, virtually all of the accuracy cartridges up until the development of the 222, all were hand-me-down brass. They were cartridges that were developed on something else. The 220 Swift was developed from the necking down the 6mm Lee Navy case, which was a cartridge that harked back to the late 1800s as a U.S. naval service round. The 22-250 varminter, that was a cartridge that was developed by necking down the 250 3000 Savage, what we call now just a 250 Savage. The 22 Hornet was a neck down black powder cartridge that was used in lever action Winchesters, and so that was developed by Whalen, whose very motto was only accurate guns are interesting. He was the armorer of the Springfield Armory. But all the cartridges that were conceived in those days for varmint hunting, they were considered to be rather underbore or too much. They were overbore. The 22-250 was considered an extremely accurate cartridge, and it became popular in the bench rest circles. But everybody knew, even at the time, that it was tough on barrels for anybody who was involved with competition. It was unnecessarily hot. You know, for the varmint hunter who wants to reach out and shoot at woodchucks 300, 400, and even 500 yards away, that's the sort of velocity he needed. But the accuracy shooter who sits at a bench certainly didn't need to have that sort of steam propulsion behind his cartridge. So, about that time, bench rest shooters were really starving for a cartridge that was a little bit more sedate, something that could be shot enjoyably at the bench, that didn't cause a ruckus, didn't cause you to go deaf after a few hours under a shade canopy, and didn't blast everybody sitting beside you. Well, Mike Walker designed this 222, and it was this 222. I'll show you in comparison again to the 223. You can see some of what I'm talking about. This here is the 222. If you'll notice, it has a very long, elegant neck. Mike Walker designed it with that neck so that it would have extremely good support of the bullet. Some people describe this cartridge right here as kind of a scaled down version of a 30-06. I'll differ with them greatly. It's actually more of a scaled down version of a 7x57 Mauser, 7mm Mauser, if you take all the scaled measurements into account. The head diameter is small. The head diameter is something that had not been used before. It required a new bolt face, and naturally, Mike Walker, being in the Remington factory, he didn't have to worry about using a cartridge that used an existing bolt face design. He simply could design what he needed, spec it all out on his own, and Remington's engineers followed suit and put it into action. Now, as you can see, the 223 differs in having a much shorter neck. It has a slightly different shoulder taper and a slightly longer body. The body length is approximately 1/4 inch longer. Now, the way the way that things turned out when the 222 was introduced in 1950, it received really a standing ovation. Everybody loved it. In the Model 722 Remington, it was capable of, right out of with factory loads, right out of the box, it was capable of half-inch groups. And that was very routine with that gun. It was an extremely accurate, fine shooter right out of the gate, and it didn't require any superior modifications to get it that way. It just was a very, everything came together beautifully with the gun. Its velocity was perfect. The velocity was about 3,200 feet per second. Now, that should sound like high velocity to you, because the average AR platform 223 5.56 doesn't even reach 3,200 feet per second, despite its greater powder capacity. The general length of the barrel is ranging from 16 inches to 20 inches for an A2 type AR-15 or M16. You're talking about velocities that are sometimes considerably less than 3,200 feet per second. A 20-inch barrel 223 velocity is round about 3,200 feet per second, which is exactly the same as the 222 is with a standard 22-inch barrel. So, you know, the velocity, it's a very efficient cartridge. I've said this before, and it bears noting, is that, you know, to achieve an additional 10% in efficiency with most cartridges, once you've exceeded the so-called standard case capacity for a given bore, once you've exceeded that, just to achieve a 10% gain in velocity sometimes requires as much as a 50% gain in actual powder. So that is one of those things that has more to do with physics than logic. We can't sometimes wrap our head around that, but cartridge cases have a certain capacity that matches a certain bore diameter for efficiency. And once that capacity has been exceeded, and you start crowding the bore diameter, then it requires more and more powder in order to just generate a little bit more velocity. So the additional velocity of a 223 over a 222 is actually more theoretical in terms of a varmeter than it is real. It gains, for an equivalent barrel length, and this is important, for an equivalent barrel length, 22-inch barrel, the 223 will achieve approximately 200 feet per second grade of velocity. That 200 feet per second grade of velocity yields approximately 50 yards in actual trajectory. So it's that's why sometimes I smile when somebody pours another 10 or 15% more powder into a case in order to achieve an additional 100 feet per second. The 100 feet per second in reality gains most rifles around 20 to 25 yards of effective range. So, you know, to put up with an additional muzzle blast, recoil, stress on the case, stress on the gun, and upping the ante of heat and all the other things that are detrimental to the life of a gun, just to gain an additional 20 yards, most of the time cannot be justified. And when you consider that I'm talking about 20 yards of point blank, if you watch my video on selecting scopes, point blank range is what I'm talking about. In other words, the distance at which a rifle can be pointed straight at a target, the crosshairs can be laid straight on a target, and the bullet will never exceed a certain height or never drop below a certain height out to that range, and that's its maximum range, which is called the point blank trajectory. But the 222 was typically loaded with a 50 grain bullet. The The 50 grain bullet was, and also target shooters certainly found that their match bullets, the 52 grain and the 53 grain match bullets, worked beautifully with this cartridge. They were ideally suited. They had tremendous support in the chamber so that the bullet stayed concentric. And that's one of the keys to accuracy, is keeping that bullet perfectly concentric with the axis of the bore. So in other words, the point of the bullet is looking down the same place as the middle of the barrel. And it's easier to do that when you have a long neck on a case. The 223 naturally doesn't have that long case, and it does quite well even despite that. But it's more difficult to get a 223 to sing quite as nice as a 222 in any situation. With my experience, and it's been always well known that if you really want to have the absolute tops in accuracy, there's nothing that ever was better than the 222 until the 22 PPC and the 6mm PPC came in the scene in the mid-70s. And those remained, they always remained rather a bench rest rifle favorite. They were never produced in any great numbers. Most of the guns that were being used in those cartridges were homemade, assembled guns. They were made from fresh barrel stock, custom actions, and everything that went along with the bench rest circuit. Some companies did, Seiko notably, came out with a line of sporters and varminters that used the PPC, but that was the Pindell and Palmisano concoction. But those were not cartridges. They never achieved quite the popularity that any commercial cartridge ever had in this country. In fact, most people wouldn't have even recognized it if they saw it on the rack. I personally know of two Seiko PPCs that sat on a rack in a local store for many, many months because I think people just simply walked by them. They didn't even recognize the head stamp. But the 222 is quite another story. The 222 reigned as supreme for a very long time as the most accurate cartridge, and it still is. If you consider all the commercial cartridges available, it still would be the most accurate commercial cartridge made, and it's the easiest one to really tune in and to make it fly straight. The 222 took its lickings from its own offspring when the military in the early 60s started examining the possibility of using small bore rifles for its service cartridge. They began looking to the 222. The 222 had exactly what they were looking for. It had roughly it was one-third the size and weight of the existing 308, the 7.62 NATO cartridge, which didn't gain them much in terms of carryability, portability, and firepower over the previous 3006. They wanted to have something, especially they were going into Southeast Asia. Vietnam was heating up at that time. They needed to have something that would that they could basically give every soldier a great number of rounds for the same packing weight, because he's going to be in the jungle, separated from support groups for the duration of the day or week or whatever, and they needed to have firepower, but without excessive weight and bulk. So this concept of small bore military cartridge came into being. And the military examined the 222, and naturally it was found to be just a little bit deficient in terms of energy and striking power given its 50 grain bullet. The 50 grain bullet with a 14 twist was absolutely perfect for the varminter, and it was absolutely perfect for accuracy, but it just didn't have the penetrating capability that they needed at 300 meters to go through both sides of a steel helmet. So that was their criteria. The next thing that they looked at was the 222 Remington Magnum that had been developed by Remington in 1957 as a civilian varmint cartridge. The 222 Remington Magnum shared the same elegant long case neck as the 222. It wasn't quite as accurate. It was very accurate. It probably sold only one for every 5 or 6 222s that were being sold. You know, it's funny how right now we consider ourselves to be velocity minded in many cases. We're looking for faster, 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 faster. But people had a rather sober understanding about accuracy versus speed in those days, and everybody knew that they would rather have a more accurate cartridge that could reach another 50 yards because of its accuracy than one that couldn't reach the potential range that it had because of that lack of accuracy. So whatever the 222 Remington Magnum had in terms of additional velocity, which gained it approximately 50 to 60 yards of range, it actually didn't shine any brighter than the 222, which got there with greater accuracy and more precision. So although it was a very good cartridge, it just didn't have quite as good an accuracy. The military looked at that cartridge and they said that was exactly the velocity and energy that it wanted. It was used with the 222 Remington Magnum up the ante by 5 grains of bullet weight, so that was exactly also what the military wanted for their cartridge, having a 55 grain full boat tail bullet with a long ogive. That was just a ticket, but Stoner's M16 simply wouldn't handle it. That long supportive neck became a problem trying to feed up into a chamber from a magazine. So it was not reliable, and it couldn't feed properly into the Stoner design. So that put everybody back to the drawing board, and out came the modification, which was the 223 Remington. The 223 Remington shortened the neck, changed the angle of the shoulder slightly, had a slight reduction in powder capacity, which effectively placed it a little bit behind the 222 Remington Magnum by roughly 75 to 100 feet per second of velocity in real terms, but it was capable of feeding capably with the rifle design that was being offered to the military. So everything worked out for it, and the rest is history. So it became a very viable military cartridge, and of course through the years, you know, the twist kept on getting faster and faster, and the bullet weights kept getting heavier and longer. So to keep up with it, but nothing ever detracted from the viability of the 222. The 222 Remington Magnum almost immediately vanished. It almost immediately vanished from the scene within 2 or 3 years of the military release of surplus ammunition for the 223. That began occurring. Fairly regularly in the mid-70s, and once that all that Lake City Arsenal and all that stuff started coming out, and all the surplus started coming out, the 222 Remington Magnum simply vanished from the scene. If you have one now, it's quite a collector's item, but the biggest problem is it's extremely difficult to find brass to load it. The 222, however, persisted for a long time. The 222 Remington remained a competitive cartridge well throughout the 80s and into the 90s, and most rifle manufacturers were still making the 222 up until the last 12 or 15 years ago. My last trip to a very large store in Maine showed me that there were five different brands of 222 Remington on the shelf, and there had to be over 35 boxes of 222 of various brands and bullet styles. So there are a lot of 222 Remington rifles still out there, and they're doing a heck of a job. Why do I like the 222, and why do I consider it to be an American classic? Well, it's a real gentleman. The report is mild. You know, it's only about 2.5 grains powder less than a 223. But boy, does that make all the difference in the world. The report is just less, and because it uses a 50 grain bullet, which is more than enough destructive power on any varmint. But that 50 grain bullet combined with the lower powder charge means that when you have a woodchuck in your scope at 200 yards away or 250 yards away and you fire, you actually see the bullet hit, which is not typical with 223s, simply because that instant that it goes off, you lose your target for a moment, and usually, unless you've got a very heavy barrel. And that's the other part of the component, is that the 222 always shot very, very well with light sporter barrels, repeated accuracy. It was not uncommon for a 222 Remington to be able to pour in 5 or 6 shots into a 3/8 of an inch group with a sporter barrel. That was a very customary thing to do, and very frequently that could be done with factory ammo. In the addition of a heavy barrel such as the Seiko Vixen that was out and popular during the 60s and 70s, with a heavier, stouter barrel and a beaver tail forend and everything, gorgeous rifle. If you ever find one of those, that's primo. With that combination, quarter-inch groups, that was not uncommon at all to have with a rifle of that sort, with a 222. I know there's many of you who will say, well, I can do that with a 223. Well, I've been there, done that, and I can tell you that whatever a 223 will do, a 222 will do just that much better. It's just that cartridge is just perfectly tuned. Mike Walker had it right to begin with. The only reason the 223 exists, as I say, is because of military necessity. It needed to have the 5 grain heavier bullet in order to penetrate steel pots at 300 meters. It had to have, and to be able to basically configure a bullet which had the design factors that the military needed. You can't have, for a full boat tail bullet and a long ogive, you can't pack that into 50 grains because you don't have enough bearing surface along the lands and grooves. So 55 grains was the only way that they could go, and that necessitated that slightly additional power. But that additional power was never a reason to shun the 222 Remington. The 222 Remington always was just a wonderful cartridge and was highly acclaimed by everybody who ever used it. Excuse me. The 222. Very unfortunately just kind of faded from the scene, and there's still CZ still makes a very nice 222. It's not quite as pretty as the old Seikos and the Remingtons and stuff with a fixed floor plate. It has a detachable box magazine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But they're beautiful guns, and I'm sure, I've never fired one, but CZ's reputation for accuracy, I'm sure that would probably be one of the greatest guns out there. Now, it was also popular. There were thousands of barrels made for this gun right here in 222. Now, I'll have to tell you this. It was a poor pairing for the cartridge and barrel. This is the 10-inch barrel Thompson Center Contender. This Thompson Center Contender was made in the first half of 1971. So, and the gun had only been released in 1967. So this is one of the early vintage Contenders. It has the octagon barrel with the Cougar, the Cougar emblazoned on the side. It has the old style release trigger guard. This was before the so-called easy open design. This has never been modified. It was recently at the Smith & Wesson factory just to have a couple of new parts installed in it, updated parts. But other than that, it's an unmodified gun. I wish that TC had made more of these in 221 Fireball, which was the 221 Fireball was a reduction of approximately 1/4 inch from the 222 Remington, so that it would fire accurately in the Remington XP100 bolt-action pistol that was based on the model 600 and 660 bolt-action. This pistol is very, very accurate. It's extremely accurate. The 221 Fireball would simply be a better pairing for this length barrel, because the powder is burned much more efficiently. And believe it or not, even though it has a shorter case, the Hornady has done extensive testing, and they found that it actually produced 100 feet per second greater velocity than the larger 222. But it keeps me going. It allows me to revisit an old friend. This gun, as a matter of fact, I have to just make a couple of comments about this. I can get the light to shine on it here so you can see. This has got the classic engraving on the side. That's actually etching, acid etching, and it has the old classic. It has the old classic grips and forend. Everything about this is original, right down to the 3-power Lobo scope. There have been improvements with the Encore, but this gun here was made less than an hour's drive from me, and it was designed by the late Warren Center, who paired up his technology with the Thompson Tool Company of Rochester, New Hampshire, and my barber that gave me this crummy haircut is brother of that Thompson. That's how small a community New Hampshire is. So it's a fun gun to shoot. It's a very accurate gun to shoot. Low report, low recoil, and again, it has everything that a guy could desire in a single shot pistol. The 222 Remington is a cartridge that I would really like to see go through a resurgence of interest. I'm hoping maybe that enough of you will take an interest in the 222 to maybe give a call to the different companies and see if they can maybe throw a few out there. Throw a few out there just as classics, just to see if people bite, because that's how things happen. I had one of the first 45 long Colts. Most appropriately, it's called the 45 Colt. The long is kind of a moniker that was attached to it. But I had one of the first reintroductions of the 45 Colt back in the early 70s, and in years since, it has really taken off. And that was only because Ruger, decided they were going to start producing something that hadn't been around for a while. The same thing happened with the 257 Roberts. The 257 Roberts was dusted off and taken out of the closet, and that became much more popular in recent years. and then that can happen to a very fine old cartridge, the 222. It's actually a very, you know, it deserves more attention than it gets. The question I'm often asked is, what cartridge would I prefer for varminting? Well, to be very honest with you, I'd probably take my personal opinion is that the best thing is to have one of each. To have a lower velocity cartridge for up to 225 to 250 yards, which is the 222 Remington, and to have for extended ranges beyond that to take out a 22-250, or even maybe the 220 Swift. Though that pair is the most efficient way to go. That way you have the best of both worlds. If I'm hunting in most of New England, shots are rarely going to exceed 200 to 225 yards. That's why that was such a darling for so many people, was because it was right in there. It was able to capture the imagination of so many shooters. They were able to take it out into their local farm pastures and have a blast with it, and literally, and without a gun that you know raised a ruckus, and without a gun that you know got the neighborhood in arms and everything. It was a very quiet, sedate gentleman's gun, and just so much more pleasant to shoot than the 223. And for those who really need to stretch out and get way out, the 22-250 is so much better than the 223. To me, the 223 has always been an unfortunate neither fish nor fowl. It was always a little bit too much for the local farm, and it was always not quite enough to be able to stretch out where the long shots really occur. So, you know, to me, the best thing was to always have a cartridge that was perfectly suited for the task at hand. What is the range of the 222? The 222 was, as I've said before, for dead-on, hold-on woodchucks, sighted in correctly, I believe, if I remember right, it's about zeroed in at about 185 to 190 yards. You're dead on at a woodchuck out to 220, 225 yards or so, 222, 225. That's the easiest way to remember it. The 223 gains about 50 yards more for what it's worth, and like I say, that 50 yards also has to be reckoned with the fact that it's not generally as accurate to get out at those ranges. And again, I know that there are some supremely accurate 223s. I've shot them, but if whatever you can get the 223 to do, that same 222 will do it just that much better. So if you really like to see holes in paper, single holes with a lot of shots in the middle of them, the 222 is always the way to go. I was first introduced to the 222 back in, it was about 1966. I had just become interested in shooting at woodchucks. I was using a Remington 572 pump 22 long rifle with a B6 Weaver scope on top. It had a half inch tube, and it was a pretty accurate gun. There was a funny story that goes along with it. There was I was shooting at a farm where I would occasionally help the Lynches do their haying, and gathering hay and baling it and throwing the bales up onto a cart as I followed along. And the deal was, as long as I put in a few hours, that I could shoot as much as I wanted on their property. So it was a pretty good deal. Well, right out behind their farmhouse, about 135 yards away, there was this big monster rock. And when I say a monster rock, it was probably 15 feet long and it was about 10 feet tall. And a big, huge monster woodchuck used to climb up onto the top of that thing in the middle of the day and sun himself for 2 or 3 hours around lunchtime in the summer. And he was utterly untouchable with a 22. Mr. Lynch's son had a 22 right behind the back door of the farmhouse, and every day he'd take one shot at him, and the same thing happened every single day. the woodchuck could actually hear the bullet coming as it dropped below the speed of sound. As I've mentioned with 22s, they drop below the speed of sound around 65 to 75 yards out from the muzzle. And after that, the sound wave is traveling in front of the bullet. And it's far enough that the woodchuck would simply hear it coming, and he'd slither down like an otter off of a snowbank. And the bullet would splash right where you could see the bullet splashing right where the woodchuck used to be, because we used to figure how many clicks up you had to go with the scope in order to get on target. Well, he was very defiant. He just simply wouldn't succumb to any shots that we could throw out there. And I was shooting about every Thursday night or so. I was shooting with my dad at a local pistol club, and I was learning to shoot handguns for the first time in my life. They wouldn't allow me, I was too young to actually shoot on the team, but they did allow me to shoot during the Mickey Mouse matches at the end of the line on my own bench. And I had my box and my scope and all that stuff, bullseye shooting. And I was shooting with my then brand new Ruger Mark I bull barrel that cost my dad $57.50, and that was the price when they first came out in 1964. So mine was one of the very first ones. But I would shoot, and at the end of the night, some of the guys would put their hat and coat on and go over to the local Army-Navy store a few miles down the road, and they'd go in and just shoot the breeze about all the different guns. It was a wonderful culture in those days. You know, people just spoke about guns, and they talked about them in a much more relaxed sense. You didn't have any threats against the Second Amendment, and you know, guns were still easily obtained without any difficulty. That pistol I spoke of, my father just simply ordered it from the Gil Hebert catalog from Illinois, and it was shipped to him a few days later. So that's the way things were. But while the guys were down at one end of the long counter talking about handguns and looking at the Smith & Wesson Model 41s and debating about the bull barrel versions versus the long barrel version and all these things and high standards, I was at the other end, and I was intrigued by the talk amongst the bench rest guys. And the bench rest guys were really fascinated with this 222. There were a few 22-250 aficionados amongst the ones that used to go way out to you know, upper state New York and places like that and shoot long range at woodchucks. But when it came to the competitors and the people that were shooting for accuracy, they were talking about the 222, and they just oozed about it. It was a wonderful cartridge. So that was something that got me going. And I was in there one night, and there were beautiful two guns out there. One was a Browning Seiko. Seiko at one time made Browning bolt actions, but there was a Seiko Browning, and it was a 222 Remington Magnum, and there was a Seiko Vixen in a 222. Both had just been recently traded in. The gentleman who traded in the Seiko Vixen had just recently purchased a 22-250 with a heavy barrel, so he could go long-range varmint shooting, and he let his 222 go. Well, I left it up to my dad. It was a matter of trying to get the necessary funds. I decided I'd trade in that 572 pump Remington, let that go, and then I offered to put up whatever I could possibly put into the deal. And my father went over there one night, and he was several guys who, including the sales clerk, who were competitive shooters, they talked him into the 222, and they said that the 222 Remington Magnum was just it was a phenomenon. It was a fad that really wasn't going to hang in there, and they were right. It never really caught on, especially once the 223 hit the scene. But they said it just wasn't going to be as accurate and as much fun as the 222. And there was never better advice. That 222 Seiko Vixen with a standard barrel was it was a happy shooter. That gun would just simply shoot all day long into the same small group. I was very fortunate at the time. A local bank president, savings bank president in my town, who was a competitive and avid varmint shooter. Whenever I gave him back my brass, he would load up a box again with 50 grain Sierra semi-pointed bullets, which he said would be even more accurate because they had a longer bearing surface, and he said they just were, and they were very, very accurate. And also they hit like dynamite when they hit a woodchuck. So that was always just a great gun, and topped with a loopholed M8, model M8, 7.5 power fixed scope with a fine duplex reticle. There just was nothing like it. Well, I went back to the Lynch farm one day with that over my shoulder, and I asked Mr. Lynch if I could take a shot at that woodchuck. And he looked at that gun and his eyes just sparkled. He said, "Wow," he said, "that is pretty." And I was quite happy. Here's a gun that was deep blue luster, like this Thompson Center Contender. It just had that deep, almost kind of a blue luster you could dive into. So the woodchuck crawled up onto the rock a few minutes later, and he was having his lunch, and his wife had just brought out a cold glass of milk that they just squeezed out of one of their cows. And I laid the forend on my hand and the back of my hand on their porch rail, and knelt down. And a second later, that woodchuck just simply died right there. Mr. Lynch never saw anything like it, and it was my first exposure to being able to zap a varmint like a laser gun. It was like shooting them with a ray gun, and he had never seen anything like it. And I was just full of pride. I beamed. I said, "Wow, I got something here." Well, I spent the next few summers until I went into the Army. I just going out, wandering his pastures whenever I could, and taking on woodchucks wherever they were, and never missed. It was just one of those guns that was so much fun. Whether I laid there prone and shot at 250 yards away, I found that if a woodchuck was at 250 yards away and I just waited for him to stand up, I just simply held up on his neck and I popped him, and that was it. So 250 yard shots were nothing. And for anybody who thinks that, I hear so much talk and read so much online about, 300 and 400 yards and all that stuff. 250 yards is a long shot with any rifle, especially when a critter is only this tall and that wide. That's a nice shot. And I like to always remind people that there's a difference between shooting and hunting. It's fun to shoot, but it's also fun to hunt, and you can combine the two. They're not mutually exclusive. And when a person is low crawling up on a pronghorn antelope that is just 50 yards too far away, or he's low crawling up on a woodchuck that's just 50 yards too far away, or whatever it is, that adds an excitement level that just can't be beat. And when you don't have to drag a Harris bipod with you, when you just simply can use a hasty sling and get into a good military prone position, or get into in those days, before I had this gut, I could get into what used to be called the jackknife position, which just folded your arms around the gun, and you could sit there and lay there for an hour, and it really, the gun never moved. It was like being on sandbags. So. But that to me, that's so much fun, and the 222 was the way to go. It was a lightweight gun. That whole gun with the scope mounted on it and everything else barely weighed 7 pounds. It was very small. The L461 action was a very short, tiny action. If there was ever a perfect woodchuck rifle that was ever made, that was the one, especially for New England farm fields where ranges were inside 300 yards. But that's what I'm going to say about the 222. I'd like to see a popular interest in this cartridge come back. I've got a lot of other favorite cartridges that I want to talk about. Some of them are still around, and some of them are on the wane. But there are no more perfect cartridges than the one that Mike Walker designed in 1950, the 222 Remington. Thank you, Mike. God bless.